Okay, my slide is the slide change is visible, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So let me just start with what is Meerkat. So it's an array of radio dishes. It's a radio interferometer, and it's situated in South Africa. As we know, Square Kilometre Array is the world's largest radio telescope to be built, and it's going to be in two components. One will be in Australia, and the other one will be in South Africa. So Meerkat is the South African precursor of SKA, and in future it will grow into the mid-frequency component of it. And it consists of 64 dishes, which are all offset Gregorian. And this configuration is chosen to reduce the blockage of aperture, and that will then improve the imaging dynamic range. And the dish layout, as you can see in the top right panel here, is somewhat centrally concentrated. The basic idea here is that the 70% of the dishes have been put into the central concentration to get very good surface brightness sensitivity to larger structures. And consequently, the baseline distribution is very centrally concentrated, and the shortest baseline is 29 meters, and it goes out to 8 kilometers. So overall, the spatial resolution that one can get, about 1.4 gigahertz, is like 5 to 6 arc seconds with closer to uniform weighting. And the important point is that it has a remote location, so it's away from most of the cities, which means that less exposure to RFI. But there is, of course, some RFI which comes from the satellites. That's there everywhere. And currently, it has got two receivers. One is called L-band, which covers from 900 to 1670 megahertz, and then UHF band, which covers from 580 to 1015 megahertz. And both the bands are operational. One can obtain data at any of these, and one can use an instantaneous bandwidth that can cover the full band with a 32K channelization in frequency. The challenge that comes with this is that if one just takes a modest integration of 8 seconds, then for an hour of data, one gets about 1 terabyte. So what this means is that not only that, although it's the most sensitive telescope, but because of the large volume of data that comes with it, it also makes the data processing also very challenging and exciting on its own. And that needs to be taken care of from the beginning itself. Right. So Meerkat, from the very beginning, decided that in first 5 years of its operation, it's going to give 70% of time to large surveys. Large surveys like LSPs, uh, uh, these are the projects which have more than 1,000 hours of observing. And so far, Meerkat, initially 10 such projects were identified. 8 of them are currently observing, and MALS is one of them. So MALS consists of a total of 1655 hours, which will be distributed across L and UHF band. It's an international team of about 40 researchers, and it's led by Shri Anand and me. So the way project is configured is that all the observing and science verification and all those activities happen in South Africa. And for these, we work collaboratively with the engineers there. And then all the data is brought to IUCA, and that's all the processing and archiving is happening here. So what we have done is that at IUCA, we have basically set up a specialized data processing facility for MALS itself. And currently it has a capacity of 3 petabytes. And eventually it will grow into 10 petabytes, and it will have a compartmentalization of a set of tapes, which will be like the slow archive. Then there will be will be a disk archive, and then the fast DDN archive which will actually be sitting on the cluster itself. The main idea of setting up this whole configuration like this is that we want all our team members to be able to actually collaboratively plan for observations, and also actually do the data processing as well, because all the team members are geographically distributed. And that's something uh, we planned, thinking that it will be a good technical requirement for the project to progress efficiently. But of course, at that time, we did not know that COVID will happen. And that has turned out to be extremely useful over last 1 year, because if this was not there, almost all of our processing and collaborative work would have halted. So in some sense, this has worked out better in the current circumstances for us. So now I'm going to go make connection with the kind of science that we want to do with the survey. The main theme is to characterize the evolution of cold gas in galaxies over the redshift range of 0 to 2. And this 0 to 2 is coming because the absorption lines that we are going to use for the survey are H1 21 centimeter and OH 18 centimeter. So given the receivers that Meerkat has, we can cover the redshift range of about 0 to 2. And then, of course, as I said, towards the end, I will talk about what kind of things that we can do with UAGMRT using its band 3 and maybe even band 5. So before going into survey themes and the data itself, let me quickly talk about what we mean by absorption lines here. So on the top in the cartoon, if you see, if there's a distance light source, which in case of absorption lines is generally a bright quasar, and then as the light source passes towards the observer, very low column density clouds from the filaments will lead to these low column density clouds, which we see in the lower wavelength range here. These are called the lamellar alpha forests. But at times, the sight line may actually pass through a galaxy or high column density gas, which is close to the galaxy, which is, if it also enriched, then it will give rise to this high column density absorber marked as a DLA, and also will generate these various metal absorption lines, which are seen in the red part of the spectrum. So in our project, we are interested in absorbers like this, which is like high column density gas of the order of 10 to 20 per centimeter square or more, and the gas which is naturally associated with galaxies. Because the connection that we want to make here is that how the cold gas, which we will detect through either 21 centimeter line or of the OH, is representative of the CNM in these galaxies or in the medium around it. And the question then to understand is that that how this gas actually then gets transferred to the galaxy and goes into the star formation eventually. So that's the basic idea one wants to get through. But for absorption lines, with absorption lines to be able to do this, one needs large number of sight lines, because only with large number of sight lines one can infer what is the incidence of such absorbers or such gas at any redshift, and then one can start making connections with kind of the questions I was describing. With just one sight line, one gets an idea of physical condition, only a cloud or few such clouds in the galaxy. One cannot make any statistical inference from that or any connection with the large scale galaxy population. So to begin with, the main requirement is that for good results, one needs large number of sight lines and unbiased sight lines as well. In case of a radio absorption line survey and cold gas, what we are talking about here is that what happens that when we refer to cold atomic and molecular gas, then these are also the conditions where a lot of dust will be present as well. So that becomes a limitation for surveys which happens at optical and ultraviolet. And that happens because like in those cases, those sight lines will be affected by dust extinction. So if any sample that we built at optical or infrared, optical or ultraviolet wavelengths, they would be biased against dust. But when we do such a survey at radio, and if we don't bias our samples or base our sample selection on any optical or ultraviolet schemes, then there is nothing to worry about a dust bias as such. So for me, for MALS, what we are doing is that we will have about 500 pointings each at L and UHF band, and each of these pointings will be centered at a bright radio source. In principle, we could have pointed them randomly, but the idea here is that since we can choose to point them at specific locations, why not point it towards a bright source, because that's where you will get the maximum optical depth sensitivity. And then, of course, since the field of view is about 1 degree square at L band, and it's like gets progressively larger as we go towards lower frequencies, then there will be like a couple of hundred sources in each pointing that would also correspond to reasonable column density sensitivity. So we can actually use them as well for this absorption line survey. So that's the basic idea of how to select the pointings. Sorry. Has the screen gone blank here actually?
Yeah, Neeraj, it says parts of the slide didn't load. Try reloading.
Okay.
Now we can see it, so you can.
Yeah.
Maybe you can just do that without the full screen if that doesn't work.
Yeah, I will try that.
Yeah.
No, let me continue with this mode actually.
Yeah.
Right. So, so I was talking about selection of pointings. So in this case, the sources that come that are off-axis sources, right? They are serendipitous sources, so they will have no bias as such. But to now target where the central pointing should be or central bright source should be, what we have done is that instead of selecting them from an existing sample of optical quasars, because that would be biased against us, we have carried out our own observations of an mid-infrared selected targets. And what happens in case of mid-infrared selection, let me explain it through this Weiss color space. So on x-axis, we have W2 minus W3 magnitudes. This corresponds to 4.6 and 12 micron. And on y-axis is W1 minus W2 color, which corresponds to 3.4 and 4.6 micron. So if we just take a typical AGN as such, then in the near infrared, the spectrum is actually just the extension of its ultraviolet continuum. But as we go towards mid-infrared and longer wavelengths, the contribution comes from the hot dust. And because of this differentiation, what happens that galaxies and AGN get naturally separated in this color space. But then there is also a preferred location for higher redshift quasars, especially if we are targeting redshift greater than 1.4 quasars, which are relevant from Mars. We have identified this wedge, which you can see through dashed lines, and this is the location where the possibility of finding a quasar at redshift greater than 1.4 is higher by about 50%. So what we have done is that we took this wedge, we identified all the radio sources brighter than 200 millijansky, which have got Weiss colors in this wedge. And then we have carried out our own observations using SALT and NOT telescope to identify, to actually basically confirm their redshift, right? Because even though we say that like 60 or 70% of them will be at redshift greater than 1.4, you don't want to observe a large number of them still having lower redshift. So we would want to confirm the redshift too. And that's what we have done using SALT and NOT. So this resulted into a sample of about 300 quasars for which we have confirmed redshifts. And then the remaining are actually picked from literature with similar colors or to be having actually very faint optical magnitudes to further compensate against the fact that some of the quasars that we pick may actually still be biased against us. So that's the way pointings are selected. And this is the overall survey footprint, like distribution of the various pointings across the sky. Another thing that we have tried to do is to, as much as possible, maximize overlaps with upcoming deep spectroscopic and photometric surveys like DCAL, STACY, and FORMOST. So the basic idea is that we do these deep observations of each pointings, and then over a period of next 2 to 3 years, we will also have good optical spectroscopy and photometry from various other surveys. That's the basic idea. And what this implies is that as a result of this, MALS is not just an absorption line survey, because on the top right corner, if you see, there is a continuum image coming from the single 1 hour observation of a pointing. And this has a sensitivity of 15 microjansky. So various pointings that we are observing, we can routinely get this kind of sensitivity. So which means that, that with about 500 pointings that we observe, it gives us a sufficient sky coverage to be a competitive continuum survey. And in the nearby universe, like up to redshift of 0.05 approximately, it's also a very competitive H1 emission line survey. Not so much for the projects like trying to determine the better constraints on H1 mass function and things like that, but more for the resolved H1 emission line studies of nearby galaxies, that kind of a thing. And in the right panel here, again at the bottom, you can see a comparison between MALS and different upcoming surveys. So for the beam size of about 12 arc seconds, we will have like a few thousand galaxies for which we will be able to do rotation curves and resolved H1 emission kind of science here. So this makes this survey quite interesting, like, because it's not just for these pursuing these different projects in isolation, but we can actually in the nearby universe make a better connection between the gas which is seen in emission and absorption, and then use that as an input to start interpreting when we detect some absorption lines at the higher redshifts, where of course we will have much less information on how the gas is distributed in emission. So that's the basic idea. So next time, okay, I have about 5 minutes left and I have only as many slides, so I can finish on time. So, so we have observed now several pointings as part of science verification and as part of the survey itself. Because science verification was successful, we have observed now 450 pointings. They are all now getting under processing. So what I'm going to focus on is this particular cycline, which is quite interesting for science verification. It's towards a 10 Jansky source, PKS 1830-211. And this is a quasar at redshift 2.5. And why this is interesting for science verification is that not just that it's very strong and compact at arc-second scales, but it contains two absorbers, one at redshift of 0.19 and another at redshift 0.89. Corresponding to the lensing galaxy. So what you see on your screen right now is the L-band spectrum covering from 870 megahertz up to 1670 megahertz. Right, there are certain regions which you can see are blanked out. There's very strong RFI coming from satellites, so not much can be done about it. Here at 1420 megahertz, of course, you can see the galactic absorption. Then if we go to, and then you can see 0.19 absorption, H1 absorption corresponding to 0.19 redshift, and here at 0.89 redshift absorber, we detect OH lines. H1, of course, is out of the band here, right? Because that will be at even lower frequency. So that is not covered in the L band. So at that time, since this was science verification, we compared this with whatever spectra were available. On left-hand side, there's a comparison between 0.19 absorber between Meerkat and ASCAP. They compare pretty well within errors. But for OH, you can find that like Meerkat spectrum has actually a very good signal to noise. But in case of ASCAP, there is this broad wing, which was later confirmed to be an artifact of poor baseline fitting, because the signal to noise was very low. So you can see that like Meerkat spectra actually are very, very high signal to noise ratio. So what we did, we pursued this with UHF2 for the two reasons, because at that time we were not sure that, okay, it's possible that the OH that we detect in our Meerkat spectrum could be wrong too, like because it's a new telescope. This is pretty much the first spectra that was taken with this telescope. So you pursued this with UHF band. So this is the UHF spectrum, which goes from approximately 560 megahertz to 1060 megahertz. And you can see that there is this OH main lines we were seeing here in L-band spectrum, right? But now we also have access to H1 21 centimeter line for the same absorber, right? But in addition to that, we also end up detecting other two satellite lines corresponding to H 18 centimeter line, which is like 1612 megahertz here, and then very faint absorption and emission corresponding to 7020 megahertz line, which is shown here. It's difficult to see it here in this full spectrum shown on the left-hand side, but in the right-hand side, one can see here. So this one, it turned out to be quite interesting because OH main lines were known in this absorber for last 20-30 years. I think for some of the first papers that you see are by on this absorber are by Jairam Chenglur actually, and the observations come from from WSRT, GMRT, and a mix of other telescopes too. So OH mainline has been known for quite some time, and the interesting thing about these OH lines at 18 centimeter is that it's a set of 4 lines, as you can see in this panel. 1665 and 1667 megahertz are called OH main lines, and 1612 and 1720 megahertz are called satellite lines generally. And if they are in local thermodynamic equilibrium, then in that case, the ratio between these will be 1:5:9:1. And that's in the order of 1612, 1665, 1666, 1667, 1720. So first question that one can ask is that if these two OH main lines are in local thermodynamic equilibrium or not, which will be the ratio of 5:9, and 1667 being the stronger line. So from the observed profiles, one finds that they are actually in LT within the errors. And then the second question one can ask is that what happens to the 1612 megahertz line? And when we apply the same model to 1612 megahertz line, we find that actually it can produce only 60% of the absorption seen in 12 megahertz. So what one needs to do is to actually also add a non-thermal component. And then another interesting thing about these OH lines is that under certain conditions, actually, especially when there is some additional far infrared pumping happening at 119 micron, then OH levels of the ground state can be inverted. And when that happens, in that situation, the satellite lines, which are shown in the bottom two panels, can actually start showing conjugate behavior.
Neeraj, 5 minutes.
Perfect. Which means that if one line shows up in emission, the other one can start showing up in absorption. So although it's very low signal to noise, you can see that there is a hint of emission and a combination of absorption happening for the 1720 megahertz line. So what we think is that we are actually seeing signatures of this conjugate behavior in the 1720 megahertz line. Of course, this is something which needs to be pursued with a deeper spectrum to get that. But this particular absorption is independently detected in our L-band as well as UHF spectrum. But of course, when we saw it in L-band spectrum where the signal to noise was even poorer, we did not at that time claim it. But since we see it in both of them, we think the absorption itself is real. But to really understand it, what's happening in this case in terms of level population is something would require a better signal to noise spectrum. So next thing one can do is to try to understand like what kind of how do we understand the absorption that is seen towards this sight line? So the radio continuum itself is quite interesting. It has two components, the northeast and southwest, which come from the core and the jet. But it also shows this nice Einstein ring here you can see in the radio continuum. So what we did was we actually used this image and illuminated this, used it to illuminate the foreground galaxy corresponding, which similar to the lensing galaxy, and try to generate synthetic profiles actually in H1 and OH. And we also then adjusted the continuum to see how it will look at very high frequencies, because this sight line also shows lots of molecular species with ALMA and at very higher frequencies like HCO plus and CH plus and ARH plus, all these things. And we tried to generate like using this model whether we can explain if the kind of absorption that we see it at low frequency and high frequency is reproducible or not. And what we find in this case is that we are able to produce the observations using the simple model where the background continuum is eliminated by this a foreground spiral galaxy. All we need to do is to adjust the differences in the continuum that are being seen at the high frequency and the low frequency, right? And apart from that, the profiles match pretty well, except for the small set of clouds that we see at very high velocity, right? So that's pretty much so. So now I will have just a couple of slides more, and I will finish in a minute. So please don't cut me before that. So this is, as I was saying, that MALS goes up to redshift of 2 approximately, and then UGMRT. So what we have done is to use UHMRT band 3, and we have observed all the quasars in our sample which are at redshift greater than 2. And what we have done is with them is to carry out a blind search of 21 centimeter absorbers with them. And also, since we have optical spectra, we also have information about what kind of atomic or ionized gas is along the sight line. This particular sample is quite interesting because this idea of having a radio selected surveys is not completely new. In past, for example, there have been surveys like Corals, UCSD, and a work by Ellison in 2008, where they have selected quasars on the basis of just the radio frequency properties, and then looked at them for DLAs, and then subsequently in 21 centimeter. What you see in each of these panels is the I-band magnitude distribution for each one of these studies, and the blue curve is actually the underlying distribution of quasars that would be based on some typical luminosity functions for quasars. Right? And what you find is that in all these studies, actually, they are cut off at much brighter quasars, whereas in our survey, we have gone to really fainter quasars, mimicking pretty close to what is predicted by the distribution itself. So what we have found from this study is that we select 6 DLAs typically and 1 DLA, and the DNDs that we find generally slightly higher than optically selected DLAs. That's quite interesting. But of course, we are like these other studies, we are also affected by higher statistical errors. And the DNDZ that we find for CNM is actually consistent with the statistics of H2 and C1 line statistics at higher redshift. These are also tracers of cold gas that can be used to look for cold gas in addition to 21 centimeter line at these redshifts, right? So this is a nice demonstration where we can actually extend the sample that comes from MALS using UGMRT to actually further extend the redshift coverage and get a good picture of cold gas up to 0 to 3.5. Right, and if that can be done in future consistently, that would be pretty exciting. But that's where I'm going to end. I'm sorry I exceeded by 2 minutes.
That's fine, not a problem at all. Thank you, Neeraj. Questions, comments? If people would like to ask a question, please raise your hand in the chat box. Let me actually start. I can just comment on the fact on 1830-21, 1720 megahertz satellite lines. Those lines are real. We saw them with the GBT quite a while ago, and we never published because the 1612 megahertz line is wiped out by RFI at the GBT.
Oh, okay. Which kind of RFI? Any idea?
Oh yeah. It's from the American Electric Power Corporation.
Ah, okay. That's why it's not there in South Africa. That's what I was curious about.
Yeah. So I spent about I think 60-70 hours of time with the GBT in the mid 2000s, working with the American Electric Power Corporation, switching off their various power supplies. But it turned out that we never got a clean spectrum. We got a kind of I'm a little skeptical, I will say, about 1612 megahertz absorption, but we can talk about that offline. But 1720 is definitely real. And the absorption emission is real.
Yeah. Because we also detected it twice, as I said, and in L-band as well as in UHF. Are you there?
Yeah. I'm just waiting for a thing from the community. Questions or comments from anybody? Looks like you convinced the crowd.
Maybe they can use the raise hand option.
Sorry?
One has.
Raise hand option is not showing.
It's not showing? Okay, so I'll just.
Oh, I see. That's why you have not convinced the crowd, Neeraj. I have bad news.
Okay, I'll try raise hand. Yeah, somehow it's not showing. So
okay, so or just unmute yourself and speak. Yeah. So does anybody have a question? Yeah, Prajwal, please go ahead. Yeah, Prajwal, do you have a question?
I can see Jasjeet's hand now.
Okay, I saw Prajwal's first, but fine, Jasjeet, go ahead.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask, I missed the very early part of the talk. What is the likely size of the survey in terms of the total number of quasars over which you will be able to do blind search in the MALS setup?
So we are so it's easier to answer it in terms of redshift path. We are expecting is something like 10 to the power 3 to 10 to the power 4. And number of quasars, if we are looking at, that would be like, we're expecting something like 200 to 250 sources per pointing. But then they are, of course, all at different redshifts.
Right.
So
no, the motivation for the question essentially was that do we get an unbiased sample of absorbers in the vicinity of, let's say, redshift 1, which right now is missing?
Yes, we do. We do. But as I said, like, again, it's better to answer this in question in terms of redshift path, because number of absorbers is something which is unknown, right? That would depend on the CNM fraction. So whether that number is 50, 100, 200 would depend on.
No. So that's why I had asked how many quasars, not the number of absorbers.
Yes.
So how many radio sources against which you will be looking for absorption systems? And you said that number will be a few hundred for each pointing.
215 to 500, yeah, that's what it would be.
Yeah. Thank you.
Menpal, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, if there's no other questions,
There is one in the chat.
Oh, is there one in the chat? I don't see
By
it. Hang on a
Menpal,
second.
you are a co-host, you can unmute yourself.
Ah, okay. From Menpal himself. Yeah.
Hi, Neeraj.
Hi, Menpal.
Is there any signature expected in X-ray band from these clouds?
Yes, absolutely. Depending on the column density and the dust content, and you could find an equivalent signature in soft X-rays and hard X-rays as well. And that's something which can be good, interesting to look at objects which are detected in X-rays. Yeah.
Yeah, because next year there is this JAXA mission, X-ray imaging and spectroscopy mission is going to launch.
Yes.
It has very good spectral resolution where we can find.
Yes. And this is interesting not just from the extragalactic perspective. I think it is very interesting from the looking at in galaxy halo also for that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I think we should probably move on now because it's past half an hour. So thank you, Neeraj, again. Clap on behalf of everybody.
Well, thanks, friends.
Yeah. Okay. So could you stop sharing your screen? And I think Menpal is the next speaker.
Yeah. Should I share now?
I think Neeraj will have to stop sharing, but I think maybe he has stopped. Yeah, you could try sharing, Menpal.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes. Yeah. It looks good. So you could go into the presentation mode.
Okay. So is it fine now?
Yeah. Perfect. Go for it.
So in this talk, where I have used AstroSat and XMM data. So recently, this work has been published in the Journal of Astrophysics and Astronomy. So this source is a narrow line Seyfert 1 galaxy located in nearby universe at the redshift 0.014, and such AGN, such narrow line Seyfert 1 galaxy is expected to have low supermassive black hole at the center and with higher accretion rate. Okay, and it has been seen in the observation in X-ray and UV. This source is highly variable, and in the available observation from XMM Newton, a strong soft X-ray axis has been observed, and it has been described by cold quantization and the blood reflection statistically equally valid for means explained by both the model. So here the log of the observation which I have used here, AstroSat and XMM observations. So here are the light curves from AstroSat SXT instrument shown here in the left side, and the right side it is XMM Newton PN data, the light curves which are shown here. The light curves here shown in different bands, 0.6 to 2 kV, 2 to 7 kV, and their hardness ratio. Similarly, here 0.3 to 2 kV and 2 to 10 kV for PN data and the corresponding hardness ratio. So from these curves, it is clear that they are highly variable in across the X-ray band, as well as the hardness ratio is also varying quite a lot. So keeping this in mind, that when we correlate the hardness ratio with the X-ray flux, and what we find a positive correlation between X-ray flux and the hardness ratio in the AstroSat observation. While in EPIC PN, which is the observation in 2014, from the XMM observatory, we find that there is a negative correlation between hardness ratio and the X-ray flux. So while fitting, when we fit linear model, we find that the hardness ratio decreases with the flux in XMM Newton data, while in Astosat data the hardness ratio increases with the X-ray flux. So one can say in the SXT data case, the source is behaving like when it is showing the nature harder when brighter. At the same time, in the EPIC PN observation, it is showing softer when brighter nature, which is rare actually in case of narrow line Shepard 1 galaxies. And here, given this nature of this source, it is behaving similar to which is normally seen in black hole X-ray binaries. So here are the plots for various black hole X-ray binaries, where we see the the uh, the relation between photon index and the relative Eddington luminosity, relative X-ray luminosity. So here you see there is a point, we call it transition point. Below it, it shows that harder uh, when brighter, and in the right side of this, it shows softer when brighter. Okay, so similar trend we are finding in this particular source. Okay, so to understand this source further, we need to find these spectral properties of this source. So for that, we study the X-ray band, where what we did, we fitted first about 2 kV data from these two observation, and then we fitted about 2 kV data using simple power law. And then extrapolated down to lower energies. And we find in both the observation, for example, in SXT case, we find this marginal axis. And in the case of EPIC PN, we find a strong soft X-ray axis. Generally, we call it soft X-ray axis. And we model these axes using a simple phenomenological model like black body model. Uh, uh, for SXT observation, we use this combination of this black body plus power law, where black body temperature, inner temperature of the disk is about 120 electron volt, and the photon index is 2.07 plus minus 0.06 in this range. And the flux in the 0.3 to 10 kV, it is 15 into 10 to the power minus 12 arc per second per centimeter square. Similarly, for EPIC PN data, it requires two black body component, where the temperature of this is around 80 electron volt, 180 electron volt, and the power law index is 2.5, 2.15 plus with the errors, and it is within the error bar in both the observation, while the flux is 21 into 10 to the power minus 12 arc per second per centimeter square. Apart from this black body and power law in both the observation, the EPIC PN, the 2014 observation requires a broad iron line around 6 kV. And we see the width of this line, Gaussian line width is greater than 0.8 kV. Okay, which is expected from the disk through this X-ray illumination on the disk. Okay, so from this modeling, it is clear that the SXT, the flux in the Astosat observation, we find that the flux is about 30% lower in case of SXT observation. So to understand more deeper what we did, we divide the astrosat light curve in 3 different uh, time segment, T1, T2, and T3. So, and we derived corresponding spectral products and we jointly fitted using simple models. And what we find that the photon index.
Manpal, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I will be done actually. So what we find, the photon index is changing within this observation, suggesting this harder when brighter nature. So, it is rare basically in this source, and it is expected softer when brighter nature, which is not actually appear in astrosat observation. However, it is showing this low luminosity Asian type nature in this particular observation, and it is expected that it is dominated by the advection flows. And due to the change, the variation, what we found in the observation, the change in photon index suggests that the Comptonization process is dominating in this particular observation. And hence we can say this observed soft X-ray axis in the astrosat X60 data, it is likely due to cold Comptonization. Coming to the further deeper understanding of the maximum Newton observation, where here we have shown X-ray data in last bottom 2 panel, and above there are 2 bands which is in UV band. And from the the visible trend which we find in X-ray, and what we find the similar trend in UV band. So it appears that the UV emission is delayed with respect to X-rays. So given to cross correlate, given the quality of data, we were not able to do cross correlation study for calculating the exact time delay, but as we see from the observation, it is expected that it is visible that UV emission is delayed. So given the
Yeah, Manpal, you should probably end.
Yeah, I am done actually. So given UV delayed emission and the broad iron line, it appears that the soft X-ray access in this observation is likely due to blood reflection. So with that, I can summarize that in both the in one of the observation, we find harder and brighter in S60, while softer and brighter in EPIC PN data. The soft access in S60 is likely due to cold Comptonization, and the soft X-ray access in PN data is likely due to blood reflection phenomena. So with that, I thank actually. I'm sorry I took.
No, not at all. That's fine. Yeah. Thank you, Manpal.
Yeah.
Questions, comments? If you like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Yeah, so I think Kiran has a question. Please go ahead, Kiran.
I have a question regarding the AstroSat and XMM Newton.
Yes.
So can we consider the counts per second for both the instrument to be same, or both are different? Like
count rate certainly different because the instrument effective area is different.
okay. So while comparing both of them, so we normalize them, or like
because I have studied separately, so no need to normalize in that case.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Biswajit has a question. Biswajit, please go ahead.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you. So my question is regarding the claim of harder and brighter.
Yes. Yes.
The quality of data, I mean, the uncertainty that you have, can you really claim harder and brighter, or I mean, what is the significance of that claim?
Actually, since it requires a little bit more detail, but it is expected, means we are not claiming that this is the certain answer, but it appears to be.
It is what you expect, right? From the source. Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks. I have one more question. May I ask? May I go ahead?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks. So regarding so have you tried? I mean, is there any plan to correlate this to emission from? I mean, observed from these two instruments, XRM Newton and Astrosat? Is there a plan to do so? Because
Yeah.
once we cross correlate, then maybe we can try to see a time lag or something else like that.
Yes, but given like this source is being observed, means today is 19. So last 4 or 5 days it is being observed from the Astrosat in UV, SXT, and probably LEX-PC as well. So we and corresponding we are having observation from the ground-based observatory from Nainital as well as from the Mount Abu. So we are expecting something cross correlation study in the multi-wavelength band.
Okay, I guess we should probably move on because we are running out of time. So thank you, Manpal.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, could you stop sharing your screen now? And
Yes.
perhaps Ganesh could share the screen. The next speaker is N. Ganesh on dynamical modeling of spiral arms in LSP galaxies. I'm not sure why my name is showing up over there, but I hope that'll change soon. Okay, great. Yeah, please go ahead, Ganesh.
Yeah, I hope everyone can see.
Yeah, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. So, myself Ganesh from Department of Physics, IISER Tirupati. So today I'll be giving a talk on dynamical modeling of spiral arms in low surface brightness galaxies. So let me start with a few images of a galaxies. So on the left, you see the image of a typical galaxy, NGC 1566, and on the right, you see the image of a giant LSB, which was the first discovered low surface brightness galaxy. And in the middle, you see image of a typical low surface brightness galaxy. So from the images, it's pretty obvious that why these galaxies are called low surface brightness galaxies. So let me move to their properties. So how do you quantify or quantitatively classify a galaxy as a low surface brightness galaxy? So if their surface brightness is greater than 23 magnitude per arc second square in B band or 25 in R band, then they are classified as low surface brightness galaxies. So this number is 1 magnitude higher than the background night sky brightness. And these galaxies are dominated by dark matter, like the mass of dark matter to the stellar mass is approximately 10 times. And by morphologically, most of these galaxies are lead type, and they have very low star formation rate, ranging from 0.0012 to 0.1 MSN per year. And these galaxies are also gas rich, where the gas mass is almost equivalent to the stellar mass, and most of these galaxies have luminosity in the range -10 to -20 in V band. And we have been only able to observe the local LSBs, which is less than redshift 0.005. So in this talk, I'll be focusing on formation and evolution of galactic spiral arms. So what are galactic spiral arms? They are the non-axis symmetric features in the galaxy, which means they are a function of azimuthal angle, and almost 2/3 of the observed massive galaxies, most of them are spirals, and the spiral arms are the primary sites of star formation, means they are pretty bright in the observed blue optical band and other bands. And if you study the strength and shape of these spiral arms, they provide clues to the dynamics of stars and gas in the galaxy disk. So here you can see images of two spirals. On the left, you see the image of a grand design spiral galaxy, M51. So it's called grand design because you can almost make a continuous line from the center to the edge of the galaxy. On the right, you see a flocculent spiral. So you have spiral features, but they are not as continuous as you see in a grand design galaxy. So both of them have different formation mechanisms, which results in two different kinds of spirals. So what are the characteristics which distinguish spiral features? So a spiral arm can be a leading or trailing arm depending how the tip points in the direction. So if the tip points in the same direction of rotation of galaxy, so those are called leading spiral arms. If they point in the opposite direction, they are called trailing spiral arms. And pitch angle is the measure between the tangent and the shape of spiral arm at a particular radius. So pitch angle of 0 gives you a circle, and pitch angle of 90 gives you a straight line. So let me move to the theories discussing about spiral arms. So in proposing a theory, the main challenge was how to solve the winding problem. We know the galaxy has a differential rotation, means the angular velocity is not same along the radius. So any group of stars which start with some structure or on a line, within 1 or 2 evolutions, this structure will be destroyed. So something kind of a spiral is not expected in a differentially rotating system. So the only possible solution is to propose that the spiral structures are stationary, which does not change with revolution of the galaxy. Now, there are mainly 4 theories which describes the formation and evolution of spirals. The most important ones are the swing amplification and the density wave theory. So in swing amplification, which discuss about the growth of local non-axis symmetric perturbations in a differentially rotating galactic disk. So the one component model was developed by Goldrich and Lindenberg in 1965. So here a leading spiral arm turns into a trailing spiral arm in few rotations. And the 2 component model was developed by Zhou in 1992. So here the spiral arm shape and amplitude changes with time. But in density wave theory, this shape does not change with respect to the rotation of the galaxy. So the main hypothesis or the proposition is the spiral arm is not a material arm, it's a density wave. And observationally, you can confirm this by observing the pitch angle in different bands. But still the issue is not well resolved. Like there are observations supporting both pictures. Now the other 2 theories are manifold theory and stochastic self-propagation of star formation. So manifold theory mainly describes the formation of spirals in barred galaxies. So you can get the shape of the spiral by recreating the orbits of stars near the 2 Lagrangian points along the semi-major axis of the bar. And this can explain both formation of rings and spirals in galaxies. And in stochastics, self-propagation of star formation, you have an initial burst of star formation which propagates throughout the disk, and this will be shared by the galactic by the differential rotation of the galaxy. So this mainly explains the flocculent spiral that I showed you in the picture earlier. Now, in this study, I have mainly used swing amplification, density wave theory, and n-body simulation to study the spiral structure. So I will focus on these 3 topics. In swing amplification, as I said, the galaxy is modeled as a 2-fluid, gravitationally coupled stars and gas in the force field of dark matter halo. So basically, we get a coupled differential equation, and we numerically solve this equation. In this equation, theta is the ratio of perturbed to unperturbed amplitude, and tau is a dimensionless measure of time. And the swing amplification mainly explains the local spiral structures like the Orion spur that you find in Milky Way galaxy. But in density wave theory, it almost gives the total shape of the spiral, the global shape of the spiral. So these equations are obtained by using linear stability analysis on Euler and Poisson equation. We assume the perturbation is in the shape of FR plus. It's a function of both radius and azimuthal angle. And you get a differential equation with for perturbed enthalpy and perturbed potential. You solve the equation for the whole gate, and the eigenspectra and the corresponding eigenvectors will give you the global shape of the spiral. So in the transient spiral or in n-body simulation, what we see is in simulations, the spiral which comes from the noise, they are never stationary structures which are found in like density wave. They change with time. which is more explained well by the Singh amplification mechanism. So as you can see, the leading spiralon turns into trailing spiralon, and which disappears after heating of the disk within 1 or 2 rotations. And like Selwood and Karlberg has already put, but the spiral activity, the global mode, can be recreated after superposing many of the transient spiral structures. And as a summary, I would just say, in n-body simulation, you find a spiral structure which evolves with time. But in contrast, density wave theory, even the spiral structure doesn't change with the rotation of the galaxy. So now I'll move to the applications, which are of the previous studies, which I use these mechanisms in contrast of LSBs. So Ghosh and Jog had already shown using Singh amplification mechanism in a typical super thin galaxy UGC 732, and that the Singh amplification doesn't show growth of any local spiral structures, and the dark matter plays a very important role. But they had used uncombinant Singh amplification, and the dispersions value were also derived after solving the one component equation. And in density wave theory, Ghosh, Saini, and Jog had already used the global model analysis to show that dark matter halo has negligible effect on the formation of spiraling in the global mode. And Kurchagin uses this same the density wave theory to match the observed spiral structure in the galaxy NGC 1566. In Singh amplification, in the n-body simulation, Selwood and Karlberg has already shown that the recurrent spiral activity can be produced by the superposition of few transient spiral mode. So in our work, to mainly study the growth of local and global spiral features in LSBs. So we have derived this stellar vertical dispersion, which using by solving a two-component model, and we have used a larger sample of LSBs, 9 of them from D-block sample, and we use a two-component Singh amplification equation, and we use density wave theory to derive the shape and growth rate of this global mode. And our previous study uses n-body simulation to check for the spiral shape in the sample of LSBs. So let me move to the result section. So in Singh amplification, you can see the response of stars and gas.
Yeah,
in
2 minutes,
total
Ganesh.
Okay, in total potential dark matter and disk potential. So the leftmost picture, you see the total potential, where you can see the perturbation's amplitude doesn't grow. On the rightmost picture, you can see if you remove the dark matter, the disk becomes almost unstable, and the local the perturbation grows and a spiral structure is formed. So it says dark matter halo plays an important role in inhibiting the growth of these spiral features. So in density wave theory, as I said, I solved the equation and I obtained the Egan spectrum. So the highest imaginary value gives the highest unstable mode. So using that, I derive the spiral shape. And the rightmost picture gives you the image of the observed galaxy, and the middle picture gives you the result of density wave. So here we get a lower growth rate compared to the NGC 1566. And from the result of n-body simulation, so we matched the observed rotation velocity and surface density profile. We only used a one component stellar disk and did in the potential of dark matter alone. So we get a central vertical dispersion around 20 km per second, and the dispersion ratio is constant to be between the 2 and 3, which is observed in these type of galaxies. So now I will compare the observed image with the results I obtained from density wave theory and simulation. So first image gives us the output of a two-dimensional fast Fourier transform. So it says m equal to 2 mode as the highest amplitude, which means the observed image has a 2-armed spiral, which is the similar case in both density wave and simulation. So now I have measured the arm contrast, which is defined by the arm contrast equation. So here I can see the simulation has the lowest arm contrast compared to both density wave theory output and observed image. And the dotted line is the observed optical radius in R band. So let me just summarize and conclude. So these LSBs have a pretty high Tumre-Q value, which inhibits the growth of local spiral features in Singh amplification. Density wave theory gives me a lower growth rate, compared to a typical high surface brightness galaxy. Simulations only show a weak spiral structure, and cold components like gas are essential in maintaining these spiral structures. So to improve the work, I have to still include a cold component like gas, which will give me a more strong spiral feature in these kind of galaxies. So I run all the code in a normal PC with 4 GB RAM and a 2-core processor. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ganesh. And we have time probably for one question. Chanda, would you go ahead? Maybe two.
Yes, I wanted to point out that Somao Ghosh and I had done the identical problem way back in 2014. And we showed that the inclusion of dark matter completely suppresses local spiral instabilities. And what Ganesh mentioned is not correct. We had included stars and gas both into fluid approach to show that even if you have stars alone being unstable, the moment you add dark matter, even if you have high gas fraction, you don't get any instability. So please look at our paper carefully. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more. Mamta?
Yeah, hi. My question is probably related to what Chanda commented. I wanted to ask about the 2-component model that they have made.
Okay.
The model approximations that you have started with, our model, the next slide, previous slide possibly. One more.
This one?
Where you have the next, where you have listed the model, the later slides.
Okay.
Our work when you started with your work, later slides, just before the graphs. Yeah, the motivation. So about just this 2-component model is what I wanted to ask. What are the approximations? I mean,
no, like we have to, in order to find the stability parameter, we need the dispersion value of stars. So to derive that, we have solved that Poisson equation and the Euler equation by considering both gas and stars. So then we derive the stellar vertical dispersion by solving the equation for vertical equilibrium.
Okay, it's just a stellar disk is what I wanted to ask, probably related to what Chanda commented.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So then I think we are probably out of time now. So I'm sorry, Sandeep. We'll have to move on. So let's thank Ganesh again. Thank you, Ganesh. And we'll move on to the next speaker, who is Sanna Gulati, and who will be telling us the multi-wavelength studies of active galaxies, NGC 1275 and Pictor-Ray. So Ganesh, would you stop sharing? And perhaps Sanna could start sharing. Thank you. Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
UGC 731. Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah.
Yeah, just go ahead. You're fine.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sanna Gulati, a PhD student working under the guidance of Dr. Tebuja Bhattacharya at Manipal Center for Natural Sciences. And today I'll be talking about multi-wavelength studies of active galaxy NGC 1275 and Pictor-Ray. So I'll begin with a very brief introduction about active galaxies. Active galaxies are galaxies which harbor a nucleus which is 10 to 1,000 times more luminous than the rest of the galaxies. And the active galaxies whose jets make a large angle to the line of sight are called as misaligned active galaxies. So today I'll be discussing about the findings on 2 of the misaligned active galaxies. One of them is NGC 1275. So it lies at the center of the Perseus cluster, and it is one of the brightest AGN in gamma rays. NGC 1275 is known to exhibit variability in long as well as in short time scales with large flaring activity. Apart from these flaring activities, the baseline flux on top of which these flares occur could also exhibit variability. So such increase in baseline flux has been observed in few of the AGNs which have aligned jets. So here I've shown the AstroSat UVIT image of NGC 1275 field where the central source is NGC 1275. So bottom one is the zoomed one. So in this work, we have utilized 11 years of observations from Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope and calculated the monthly averaged gamma ray light curve, which is shown in the top panel over here. So as you all can see that though there are short-term flares, the overall flux of this source has increased till 2017, and after that there is this broad flare. Now, to understand this increase in the flux, we have defined different activity states based on the cumulative flux distribution. Now, if my source flux is constant, the cumulative flux will be linear. However, if it increases in the stepwise fashion as shown in the bottom left panel over here, then the slope of the cumulative flux will keep on increasing. So for NGC 1275, we calculated the cumulative flux, which is shown in the bottom panel, and we found that till 2017, it can be fitted with 3 straight lines of different slopes. An intersection of these lines defines the boundaries of the states. So we define 4 states, state 1, state 2, state 3, and state 4, and we calculated the average gamma ray flux for each of these states and found that there is an increase in the baseline. That is, the average flux has increased as we go from state 1 to state 4. So, but there is no much change in the spectra. So we then looked into the multi-wavelength data, and we analyzed X-ray, UV, and optical data from the SWIFT satellite and found that there is an increase in the average fluxes in the X-ray and UV optical bands also, similar to what we have seen in gamma rays, though there is no much change in the spectrum. Also, the source was observed twice by AstroSat, which are marked by arrows over here. So during AstroSat observations, the source was in a high gamma ray activity state. And to understand the increase in the baseline flux, which we have observed from state 1 to state 3, and the behavior of the source during this high gamma ray activity state, we have carried out construction and modeling of the broadband spectral energy distributions during the first 3 states and the AstroSat observing periods. Here, I would like to mention one thing, that things are not very simple in the X-ray band. This is because NGC 1275 is lying at the center of the cluster, which is the Perseus cluster, and there's a lot of emission coming from this cluster by thermal brainstalling emission process. Now in SWIFT-XRT, we have a good PSF, about 0.3 arc-minute, so we are able to constrain the cluster parameters well. However, in the case of AstroSat SXT, which has a large PSF of 15 arc-minute, and LAX-PC, which has an FOV of 1 degree by 1 degree, there is a huge cluster contamination, and constraining the cluster parameters is an extremely challenging task. However, it is essential that we constrain our cluster parameters properly, because that would affect the flux from our source. So it would overestimate or underestimate the flux from our source. So it is very important that we constrain the cluster parameters well. So we were lucky enough to have a simultaneous SWIFT-XRT observation during the first AstroSat observing period. And we fixed the contribution of the AGN while analyzing the SXT and LAX-PC data using this simultaneous SWIFT-XRT observation, and we find the cluster parameters. Now, these cluster parameters we use in the second AstroSat observing period, where we have no simultaneous SWIFT-XRT observation, and we determine the contribution from AGN. Now, this we could do because cluster parameters are not expected to vary in the small time scales. So this I've explained very briefly over here. I'll not go into the analysis details. So here I've shown the broadband SEDs of the first 3 states. So we used a single zone leptonic emission model to model the SEDs, where the first hump is by the synchrotron and the second hump is by synchrotron self-Compton emission process. And from modeling of these 3 states, we find that optical emission could not be explained by synchrotron because of probable contamination from the host galaxy or the cluster or the disk. But the X-ray or the gamma ray emission are well explained by the SSC process. We find that increase in the jet particle number density without any change in the shape of the spectrum could explain the increase in the baseline flux observed during S1, S2, and S3 states. However, we have an interesting result when we come to AstroSat observing periods. So what we find is that during AstroSat observing period, when the source is in a high gamma ray activity state, the whole SED has shifted towards higher energy, as shown in a schematic below. So when the SED has shifted to higher energy, the X-ray, which was previously lying in the rising part of synchrotron self-Compton, is now in the falling part of synchrotron. So this you can see in the AstroSat SEDs, which are shown on the right-hand side also. Here, this orange is by the SWIFT-XRT emission, which is lying in the synchrotron hump. And also this is by, in AS2 time, this is SXT and LAX-PC, which is again in the synchrotron part. So this work has been accepted for publication in monthly notices of Royal Astronomical Society recently. So I'll now discuss about the other source, which is Picture A. So it is a Phanerophylla type 2 galaxy, which has a distinct core, jet, and a hotspot, as you can see in this image. Hotspots are the bright emission at the end of the jet flow, and this core and hotspot has been observed in radio, IR, optical, and the X-ray bands. However, the emission mechanism of such sources are not well understood, particularly in high energy, because they are weak sources. So we also observed this source with AstroSat. So AstroSat observed this source in 2 NUV and 1 FUV filters, and we could resolve the core and hotspot separately in all of the 3 filters. And then we looked into the archival data also. We analyzed the archival data from Swift and Fermi satellites. And right side is the color composite image of the Picture A field. So blue color is from the AstroSat UVIT, these blue contours. Green is from the optical filter of Swift UVOT, and red is the X-ray emission. So here also I would like to mention that in AstroSat UVIT, when we observed the source, we detected the hotspot for the first time in far UV band. Now, to understand the emission of the core and the hotspot, we have carried out construction and modeling of the broadband SEDs of the combined core and hotspot emission and only the hotspot emission. So this is the SED of the combined core and hotspot emission. Now, this is essentially the SED of core only, because the emission from hotspot is around 3 orders of magnitude lower when compared to core. So this is SED of core only. And here we have analyzed data from Swift UVOT, which is shown in green, and blue data points are AstroSat UVIT. There is a blue butterfly diagram here, which is AstroSat SXT. This is AstroSat LAX-PC in red, and there is a Fermi. Now, from modeling of the spectral energy distribution, we find that there is an excess in the UV optical band. This could be because of the emission in the from the accretion disk. And this is quite expected because this source is known to exhibit very broad Balmer emission lines. Also here the equipartition condition holds, that is the particle energy density is equal to the magnetic energy density, and the fairly high magnetic field value of around 6 Gauss was required to explain this SED of the core. Previously also there have been some studies to model the core SED, but with very limited observations. But now with a very long coverage by Fermi Gamma Space Telescope and also the AstroSat instruments, we are able to constrain the SED of core quite well. We also fitted the SED of the hotspot. So first, this magenta and the black data points are taken from Isobe et al. 2020. Green and blue points are from Swift UVOT and AstroSat UVIT from our analysis, and this is butterfly is from the Swift XRT band. Now we find that using a single zone electronic emission model, if we want to explain this SED, we find that if we want to explain the X-ray emission, then model over predicts the flux in the FUV band. Also, unlike core, where the particle and the magnetic energy density were almost same, here the emission is particle dominated, and also a higher cutoff energy of electrons is required to explain this SED. Now, if you want to explain FUV, then model cannot explain the emission in the X-ray band. So there was a recent study by Isobe et al. In 2020 who had found that there is an excess in the infrared band. This plot is from Isobe et al. 2020. Now to explain this excess, they had fitted two mathematical functions to this SED, geometrical functions.
Sana, 2 minutes.
Yes. The motivation to use the two models came from the work of Tingde et al. In 2008, who had reported that hotspot comprises of some substructures which are embedded in a diffuse region. So they used two functions. One they are calling as a main component, which is shown by the dotted line, that is a cutoff PL model. Another they are calling as an excess component, the power law model, which is this triangle over here. So now, however, they had no coverage in the FUV band. Also, X-ray emission they did not take into account, and they have used a geometric fit rather than a physical model. So in our work, we have used again a two-zone model, but we have used a physical model comprising of synchrotron and synchrotron self-contained emission processes. And we find that our preliminary modeling suggests that X-ray is coming from the substructures. Actually, this black dotted lines are from the zone 1, which I'm calling as a diffuse component, and this blue dotted one is from the substructures which are embedded within this diffuse region. So X-ray is probably coming from the substructures rather than the diffuse region. So our preliminary modeling suggests that. However, we are still investigating the parameter space of the SED to make any firm conclusions. So this is my summary. So in NGC 1275, we have a first evidence of the increase in the gamma ray baseline flux in MSGN class. And there's an increase in the average fluxes in gamma ray X-ray UV optical bands as we go from state 1 to state 3. Also, when the source was in a high gamma ray activity state, we find that there is a shift in the synchrotron profile, that is during the astrosat observing periods. And this was accepted recently in MNRS. And in PICTA-Ray, we have a first comprehensive study of the core utilizing Fermi and astrosat observations. Also, I mentioned that there's a first coverage of hotspot in FUV band, and it is playing a very crucial role to constrain the hotspot emission. And our multi-zone model is required to explain hotspot emission, which has our preliminary findings suggest that X-ray could be coming from substructures. So this work is under preparation. And I would like to thank all my collaborators. I would like to thank the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity, and also the financial support of ISRO under AstroSat Archival Data Program is acknowledged. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. We have time for a couple of questions. The first one is from Amit.
Thank you. Hi, Sana. Very good talk. I just want to know, as you suggested that you have used Swift XRT to constrain the contribution from the cluster, and that same parameters might have been used to compute the AGN component from the AstroSat or SXT instrument. So how you dealt with the systematics of these two instruments?
Systematics, yeah, so actually during the first AstroSat observing period, we have a simultaneous Swift XRT observe. We are not carrying out any combined fit. We are just using the flux of this. So during first AstroSat observing period, we have a simultaneous Swift and AstroSat observation. Now we calculate the source flux in the same energy band. Using the Swift XRT, we calculate the source flux for the SXT and the LAX-PC energy band, and we fix the source flux to that during the first AstroSat observing period, and we derive the cluster parameters. So AstroSat 1 observing period, first AstroSat observing period, we are using just to derive the cluster parameters. And then those cluster parameters we are using in the second AstroSat observing period. And yeah, so since there is we are taking, like in fitting and all, we are taking 2 to 3% systematics in the expect. That is because of the, like as suggested by instrument team.
But there is no cross-calibration.
I think we have to move on to the next one. You continue this over Slack. I think Pankaj has a question.
Hi. Actually, I had the similar question, so Amit has asked, but what I was, I'm still curious about the same stuff, whether how confident you are that the flatness that you are seeing is not due to the thermal Bremsstrahlung that cluster are supposed to emit strongly.
Yeah, so that's what we are not, okay. Yeah, so we are not carrying out any combined fit for that. We actually, so cluster has these 3 parameters, which is temperature, abundance, and temperature, abundance, and normalization. So abundance, we have taken from the Churazov et al. Paper, who had carried out a detailed study of the radial dependence of the cluster parameters. So we averaged it to 15 arc-minute, and we fixed our this abundance. And temperature and normalization we are constraining, because when we have a very large field like 15 arc-minute or so, then those parameters are expected to vary. And temperature, still what we are getting from our fitting is consistent with the temperature values which are reported in the previous studies of the Persis cluster.
Okay, just quick clarification. So when you are fitting AstroSat data,
yes,
you already have the cluster component, Bremsstrahlung thermal component already included there, right? Fixed from the Swift XRT, is it?
Okay, no, this cluster contribution we are constraining from the first astrosat observing period where we have a simultaneous swift XRT observation.
No, I agree. What I want to say is, let's say in the
Yeah, I think we have to cut this
Okay,
short.
okay, fine.
Sorry about that. So I think this is the kind of thing one should really discuss over Slack. So thank you, Sana, and let's move on to the next, the final speaker of this session, who is Shilpa Shashikumar. Shilpa, could you share your screen? Shilpa will be talking about radio polarization study of 3 Zwicky 2. I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay, so you can see my screen, right?
Yes, yeah, looks fine. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So hello everyone, I'm Shilpa Shashikumar and I'm a PhD student at NCRA working under the supervision of Preeti Khurb. And today I'll be presenting the results from our radio polarization study of a radio intermediate quasar 3 Zwicky 2 using UGMRT and VLA that reveals a composite jet and wind outflow. First, I'll give a brief background of our work. The radio-loud radio-quiet dichotomy has been one of the well-known problems in the agent community. Kellerman et al. 1989 had given the definition of the radio loudness parameter, which is the ratio of 5 GHz flux density and optical B-band flux density. According to this definition, AGN can be classified into radio loud AGN with R value greater than equal to 10, radio intermediate AGN with R value lying between 10 and 250, and radio quiet AGN where R value is less than 10. It is not clearly understood why only 10 to 15% of the AGN population launch powerful outflows such as jets that go up to hundreds of kiloparsec or megaparsec scales, whereas the vast majority of the Asian population launch very weak outflows such as jets that are typically less than 10 kiloparsec scales or are often diffuse and wind-like. While there is a good consensus about the radio emission in radio loud AGN, the origin of radio emission in radio quiet AGN is poorly understood. It has been often suggested in the literature that radio intermediate AGN are the relativistically boosted counterparts of radio quiet AGN. So in the light of this hypothesis, we suggest that studying outflows in radio intermediate AGN can provide better insights into the origin of radio emission in radio quiet AGN and also on how they compare with the properties of the better studied class of radio loud AGN. Moreover, the fact that radio intermediate AGNs straddle this radio loud radio quiet division, they are ideal candidates to understand the origin of this dichotomy. Moreover, there are several gaps in understanding the different modes of AGN outflows, primarily the jets and winds, and how each mode affect or influence their host galaxy properties, which is the so-called AGN feedback process. And this problem can be better understood if studied in systems where multiple emission mechanisms coexist. Mehedipur and Constantini 2019 have shown that both jets and winds can coexist in radio intermediate AGN. Radio polarimetric observations in principle can help to distinguish between jets and winds based on the differences in their fractional polarization, inferred magnetic field structures, and rotation measures. So here I have presented the radio optical overlays of the 3 Zwicky 2, which is in fact the first Seyfert galaxy where a superluminal radio jet was discovered. It also is included in the Paloma Green quasar sample. It has a radio loudness parameter value of around 200, which makes it a radio intermediate quasar. Also, there are evidences of the presence of accretion disk wind and ionized wind reported in the literature. Here we present the 685 MHz UGMRT total intensity contours in green superimposed over SGS's G-band optical image in color. A triple radio structure with the core hotspot is clearly detected and a misaligned lobe is also detected. This inset displays the 5 GHz VLA total intensity contours in green superimposed over the HST optical image. Here we clearly see a curved jet. We also see that this curved jet does not terminate in a compact hotspot, which is similar to those observed in FR2 radio galaxies, but in a bow shock-like radio structure. So this white curve shows this bow shock-like feature that I'm talking about. Now this feature is also seen on the counter jet side, which I have not shown here, but you'll see it in the next slide. So similar structures on both jet and counter jet side rules out the possibility of this feature to be a sharp jet bend that results when the jet encounters a density inhomogeneity in the IGM. So this has to do with, this has to be more of an intrinsic effect. This morphology is also seen in the restarted jet simulation works by Clark and Burns 1991. So this is the figure from their work. Here, the authors have proposed that when a restarted jet is launched into a region of thermalized plasma from the previous episode of jet activity and is therefore overdense compared to the old jet material through which it passes, a protrusion is seen at the leading edge of its lobe. So that's what you see here. And this is similar to the Bow-Shock-like morphology that we see at the jet terminal regions in the 3-Zwicky-2. So this is indicative of restarted jet activity in 3-Zwicky-2, which is in turn consistent with the evidences of intermittent jet activity reported in literature in 3-Zwicky-2. Here we have presented the spectral index image created using 685 MHz UGMRT data and 1.5 GHz VLA data. Here we do see an inverted core, and the mean spectral index values for the primary and the misaligned lobes is around -0.6 to -0.7. So this rules out the possibility of the misaligned lobe to be a relic lobe. Secondly, we do not see any clear spectral steepening with distance from the core in these lobes. And these characteristics are similar to the lobe characteristics that is seen in the sputtering AGN NGC 3998. Now here we have presented the full radio structure. So this is the counterjet site that I was talking about. This is the 5 GHz VLA contours, and the red ticks are the electric polarization vectors or the chi vectors whose length is proportional to the polarized intensity. And the inlaid here is the polarized intensity image. We find that the kiloparsec scale unresolved core in the total intensity is resolved into a double radio structure in the polarized intensity. We also see that the chi vectors show a transition of around 90 degree across these substructures. Such a 90-degree flip has been often seen in the VLBA images of blazars, and they suggest that the unresolved core actually contains a core and inner jet component, where the northern component is optically thick core and the southern component is the optically thin jet. Now, for optically thin emission, the inferred magnetic fields would be perpendicular to the chi vectors, and for optically thick, the inferred magnetic fields would be parallel to the chi vectors. So for the core which is optically thick, the inferred B fields would be in this direction, and for the inner jet, the inferred B fields again would be this direction because that's optically thin. So overall, we find transverse B fields in both the core and the inner jet. In order to probe the regions inside the core, we have analyzed VLA archival data at 34 GHz, and we only detect a bright component which spatially coincides with the inner jet component detected in the polarized intensity 5 GHz image. So such a dimming of the radio core and brightening of the radio jet has been observed recently in few of the blazars, and a favorable explanation is that it could originate from a propagating shock interacting with the ISM. So there's enhancement of both magnetic field and relativistic plasma due to shock compression at the jet head, and this is what gives rise to an increase in synchrotron emission and an increase in the flux density in the jet. And the radio core is probably reflecting the rarefied region of the propagating shock, and that probably explains the drop in its flux density below the sensitivity level of this image. Here again, it is a 5 GHz VLA contours, but now the vectors, the length of these chi vectors is proportional to the fractional polarization, which is the ratio of polarized intensity to total intensity. Now, as it was already revealed in the previous slide, we see that the jet is not polarized. The southwestern lobe is polarized. Now, this is optically thin region, so the B fields would be aligned with the edges of this lobe, and that is consistent with the magnetic field amplification due to shock compression. We also find rotating chi vectors at the edges of the core. Now, assuming optically thin emission, this would suggest B fields being compressed along the edges. This can happen because of an expanding cocoon driven by a wind that results from the disruption of an inclined jet. Now, this is a model that is proposed by Mukherjee et al. 2018 in their numerical simulations, where they demonstrate that wide-angle outflows can result from inclined relativistic jets. So their model is the following. There is an inclined jet. Now, so there's a strong interaction between the inclined jet and a dense interstellar medium, and this can cause the jet to deflect and disrupt and also break out into a subrelativistic outflow, which is reminiscent of the typical AGN winds or the nuclear starburst. This wind will create a spherical bubble like an expanding cocoon that clears the ambient medium as it rises, and the jet will eventually proceed along its axis of launch to some extent. However, there's an alternate possibility that these rotating vectors are they are also reminiscent to those seen in the simulated polarimetric images of the accretion disk in M87. So then these vectors could suggest that they indicate the base of a magnetically driven AGN wind. Now here we present the UGMRT total intensity 685 MHz contours superimposed with chi vectors whose length is proportional to the polarized intensity. We would like to mention that we have developed a Python script that can produce both the total intensity and the polarized intensity UGMRT data, which is available here. Now here we find that both the jet and the southwestern lobe are polarized. One thing to note is that the chi vectors, they match between both UGMRT and VLA data. Now, assuming optically thin emission in jet and the lobe, the inferred magnetic fields is transverse to the outflow, which could either indicate the shock compression scenario or could represent the toroidal component of a large-scale helical magnetic field associated with the jet. The presence of Lang-Garrington effect is also revealed in the lobes of this quasar. The Lang-Garrington effect is the following. So the radio emission coming from the receding lobe, which in this case is the northeastern lobe, will pass through more magneto-ionized medium and therefore is subjected to more Faraday rotation and will therefore be more depolarized as compared to the southwestern lobe, which is the approaching lobe. Now the fact that the jet is depolarized at 5 GHz, that was in the previous image, but polarized at 685 MHz is an effect of inverse depolarization phenomenon, because usually depolarization is observed at low frequencies. And this phenomenon can be explained by as a combination of inhomogeneous magnetic fields which cancel
Shilpa, 2 minutes.
Yes, inhomogeneous magnetic fields coupled with internal Faraday rotation. However, the works by Miller et al. 2012 and Mehdipour and Constantini 2019 have shown that there is a close association of toroidal magnetic fields, so that would appear as transverse in observations, and toroidal magnetic fields with the wind, and poloidal magnetic fields which would appear longitudinal to the outflow in observations with the jets. So therefore, one cannot rule out the possibility of this transverse B field structure to be associated with an AGN wind threading toroidal B fields. Now, when I'm saying AGN wind, again, it could be either the magnetized accretion disk wind or the outer layers of a widened inclined jet. So this refers to the Mukherjee et al. 2018 model. Because of inherent difficulties in model state and numerical simulation, one cannot fully differentiate between these possibilities. Moreover, although we do see indications of more than one mode of outflow in 3Zwicky2, which is consistent with the literature, we are not able to confirm the same with the current observations. For example, we do not see evidences of poloidal magnetic fields in the jet. So for that, one requires highly sensitive observations that can sample the poloidal fields in the jet. So the overall, the outflow in 3Zwicky2 can be considered as a combination of a jet and a wind, where the jet is embedded inside the wind. So that's a coaxial geometry which would appear co-spatial in projection. And this resembles the jet plus MHD disk wind model that is revealed in the protostellar system HH212. Now, as an attempt to explain the radio intermediateness of 3Zwicky2 with this composite jet and wind model, we refer to the works by these authors where they have shown that intermittent jet production can be associated with changing spectral states of the accretion disk. So changing spectral states meaning there's a transition between soft spectral state, which gives rise to suppressed jet and strong winds, and hard spectral state, which gives rise to powerful and steady jets. Now the transition between these states occurs on timescales of 10 to the power 6 to 10 to the power 8 years in regular radio loud and radio quiet AGN. But in sources with sputtering and intermittent AGN, these transitions can occur on decadal timescales. So then one may always find a combination of a jet and a wind, such that the wind is launched from the outer regions of the accretion disk and jet is launched from the inner regions of the accretion disk. So then this will give rise to a coaxial geometry that we are seeing. When there is an interplay between the jet and wind, due to the interaction between them, it's possible that much of the mass and the energy is carried away by the wind rather than the jet, or that the jet is disrupted. So this could explain why the jets in radio intermediate AGN are in general low powered and small scaled. So therefore, we propose that changing spectral state of the accretion disk coupled with the intermittent behavior of the outflow along with a close interplay between jet and wind might be responsible for the radio intermediate nature of 3Zwicky2. And this is consistent with the works of Nipoti et al. 2005 and Nyland et al. 2020, where the authors say that radio loudness parameter is a function of the epoch at which the source is being observed. So I'll leave you with a summary and thank you.
Thank you, Shilpa. Questions, comments? Please raise your hand. It looks as though everybody is desperate for coffee.
I have allowed unmuting themselves in case anyone has a question and wants to ask.
Yeah, so please go ahead and ask directly if you would like to ask. Yeah, or alternatively, Shilpa, you've convinced everybody. Yeah. Okay, so let's thank Shilpa again then. Thank you, Shilpa.
Yeah.
And I thank all the other speakers as well. Pardon me for allowing the thing to go on for about 5 or 6 minutes longer than scheduled. But thanks everybody for coming, and we'll close the session here.
Yeah.
Harvinder, did you have any